It disappeared with 162 passengers on board. Now the man in charge of the search for the missing AirAsia flight says it's probably at the bottom of the sea. Should we be more worried about aviation safety? And are airlines doing all they can to track their planes? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The fate of AirAsia flight QZ8501 is once again raising concern about the commercial aviation industry. Well, the plane disappeared on Sunday after it took off from the Indonesian city of Surabaya on its way to Singapore. It prompted a similar mix of anguish and mystery that followed the disappearance of a Malaysia Airlines plane 9 months ago. Questions about aviation safety, the tracking of commercial planes and the rights of passengers and their relatives are once again the focus. Just minutes before air traffic controllers lost contact with the AirAsia flight, its pilot had asked permission to fly at a higher altitude to avoid bad weather. The events seemed to have a striking resemblance to the crash of Air France 447 on a flight from Rio to Paris in 2009. Well, back then, investigators found that climbing in dense, so-called towering clouds can lead to a build-up of ice particles, which in turn can cause airspeed indicators to malfunction. Well, this kept the pilots from reacting properly to changes in flight speed. And as the plane slowed down, it began to stall. The Air France pilots kept pulling the plane's nose up at a sharp angle instead of pushing it down to gain speed as the aircraft plummeted into the sea. Well, it was at roughly the same altitude as AirAsia Flight 8501 when it lost radar contact. Let's bring in the guests into this edition of Inside Story for us. Joining us from Hamburg is Tobias Rueckerl, an aviation consultant. And on Skype from Wellington, John Walton, an aviation journalist. Welcome to you both. Let's start with Tobias first, if we could. Planes disappearing, instruments freezing up, planes being shot down, going through clouds, never coming out apparently. Is it still safe to fly?
Definitely, it is safe to fly. I think the aircraft is still one of the safest mode of transport. Of course, it's not free from any failure. And thus it's extremely important that we find now the aircraft wreckage and especially the black boxes to find out what happened and draw the right conclusions out of that.
John, what has changed since the disappearance of the Malaysia Airlines flight? What has the industry learnt from and done any differently?
Change has been slow, as you might expect. These are wide-ranging proposals that have been made, and it's important to make sure that they're the right proposals for the right sort of measures that people want to take.
So, I mean, what are the right proposals? Has anybody introduced the right proposals? What's actually different for me if I'm a passenger getting on a plane? Do I have anything to comfort me?
Right now, very little. However, the comfort, I think, goes back to something that Tobias was saying, which is that aviation is extremely safe. Even despite the high-profile incidents this year, 2014 still has the fewest fatal airliner incidents of any year. And it's by no means on track to set any records, even in numbers of fatalities, despite the two large airliner incidents already, and again, this incident that we're talking about now.
All right, so it's maybe a safer year, but Tobias, the troubles of both AirAsia and Air France planes seem to involve storm clouds, right? Planes going into storm clouds and then we don't see them again so far. Is it time to review the rules of flying into storm clouds?
I think the storm cloud, that's only a factor in these incidents. If you look into the crash investigation from the Air France flight, we find out that the response of the pilots was simply wrong. It is safe to operate even in stormy weather, but the human factor is widely underestimated. I think aircraft are built to operate in severe weather conditions. The trouble are often, unfortunately, the pilots and the human factor.
We'll talk a little bit more about human factor in a minute, but John, is there a problem with radar and flight system infrastructure over parts of Asia, since we've now had two planes that, you know, people are looking for extended periods, shall we say?
Radar extends at a general level only a few hundred nautical miles off the coast of any one country. In this particular area, Australia has an over-the-horizon radar called shone, which should in theory have captured some of the movements of this aircraft. But as we're looking at now, in the search for debris, for wreckage, and indeed, as Tobias said, for the black boxes, we're really looking at a fairly large area, because as much as we can track an airliner at altitude, it's the 32 to 38,000 feet between it departing from its normal flight and its impact that is something that we're not able to track yet, except by radar. And it doesn't seem that the radars were able to track it from sky to sea level, as it were.
But John, I mean, aside of tracking, which we will want to talk about in a minute, what I mean is, it does make a difference what part of the world you fly over, correct, when it comes to how advanced ground systems are, whether it's radar, whether it's ground control, the technology they have. Is that not correct, John?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, this area of the world is very highly trafficked by airliners and has some fairly advanced infrastructure that perhaps somebody not familiar with the situation might not expect. There's a lot of radar around. Indeed, in the last few years, more has been installed and more effective radar has been installed. So it doesn't seem to me like there is any sort of accusation of that Indonesia's airspace is controlled by less capable radar than anywhere else.
All right, Tobias, how much of a difference does it make what airline you're flying when it comes to flight emergency procedures? How strict flight rules are and how they're observed? Does that depend on the airline, the country that you're flying a carrier of?
Well, of course, there are airlines which have a better training and other ones which are, let's say, less trained. But as a normal passenger, it's impossible to find out. So you simply have to trust an airline you are choosing. Of course, the large carriers are more capable to do extra trainings for pilots for some situations. There are some smaller carriers in parts of the world where this is not happening. So have a look into Africa, some parts of Asia, some parts of South America. There are, of course, smaller airlines. But AirAsia or Malaysian Airlines are not small airlines. These are airlines which have very high safety standards. And the thing why now these incidents or accidents happened, that is what we have to find out now.
I mean, what about the questions of the type of plane that one flies? I mean, obviously these are factors that make a difference to one's flight safety, Tobias. I mean, how much research, though, should a passenger be expected to do these days before you get on a plane?
I think the usual passenger has not really a chance to get this information and to find out. We are now talking about an A320. That is one of the most built airliners in the world. More than 5,000 are flying around. And if you have a look into the safety record of the A320 type, or the whole line of aircraft with 380 and 321s, you find out that it's a very safe aircraft, and that the most accidents have nothing to do with the type of aircraft or how advanced it is, but it has to do with the human factor.
Pilot error. Well, we did John mentioned there, in fact, the issue of tracking a plane, which begs the question, how exactly do you track a plane? Well, air traffic controllers monitor the skies using two types of radar, primary and secondary. Now, primary radar is the most basic type. It gives air traffic controllers an approximate position of the aircraft. Secondary radar is a bit more advanced. It uses transponders on the plane to transmit data, including the plane's speed and direction, back to air traffic controllers. But once a plane is some 250 kilometers out to sea, radar coverage fades. pilots keep in touch using high-frequency radio. Now, some planes now use the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS. That sends data on aircraft performance back to the carrier and manufacturer through radio or satellite. The line of communication between ACARS and satellites isn't constant. So the question is, I guess, why don't planes use GPS technology? Many of us have it on our phones. Well, in fact, planes do use GPS to show their position on a map, but that data is not usually shared with air traffic control, largely because we're told it would be too expensive and too hard to justify. And that's because incidents like this are still incredibly rare. John, that still doesn't answer, I guess, the question in my head, which is, how can it be considered too expensive to have a system to track planes through GPS, and yet it's not considered too expensive to have a system that can track everybody's smartphones by GPS?
Well, I think that there are these certainly two different things. You can certainly, as I was saying earlier, track an aircraft at cruise level fairly easily. The ADS-B system, which in the US is part of the FAA's next-gen air traffic control system, which is coming into play as we speak. That system is essentially a GPS box that is on the plane, which then connects via in-flight connectivity to a satellite and essentially says, here I am. Now, the question I think that's important to ask is, in terms of all the safety improvements we could make in aircraft, is this the one that will save the most lives? Is this the one that will prevent passengers from being injured? And is this the one that will improve safety across the board? The jury is in many ways still out on that. And I think it's important to note that in this discussion.
OK, the jury may be out, but I guess my basic question, let me take it to Tobias, is why is it still considered, whatever the stage of the debate is, why is it considered too difficult to simply track an aircraft with GPS? Why are there all these reasons given about how it can't be done, and yet we all carry smartphones in our pockets which can be tracked? I think that's a basic question that many people simply don't find a convincing answer to.
I think there is possibly an answer to it, and it's all about costs. That's a hard reality. I think we have also other industries where not possibly airliners, but also insurers simply calculate what is cheaper. That sounds very rude, but that's the reality. So as long as it's cheaper to pay for an accident, like a disappearance of an aircraft, I think most airlines will choose for that option, even if they don't like it, instead of installing very costly location locators on the aircraft, either GPS-based or other modes of technique. That's definitely a problem. I think if the technical side would be cheaper and the insurance side would be more expensive, we would have immediately these techniques on the aircraft.
John, is the problem cost, or is the problem awareness and education? I mean, airlines spend, some airlines spend a lot of money in installing the latest in-flight entertainment systems, right? But that's probably reflected in higher costs for those airlines, but people still fly them because they feel like they're getting value. Is the problem information, for people being aware that they would be willing to pay a little bit more money perhaps if they knew that they're flying an airline which has all of these extra safety or tracking features on it? Is the problem just getting the information out to the public?
I don't think so. To be honest, the majority of airlines worldwide, and certainly in the developed world, and a lot of the developing world, their safety standards are excellent. AirAsia is one of those airlines. Let's be clear. Their only across all of the AirAsia group, their only notable incident was a very small one, which was a hard landing all the way back in 2007. Nobody was injured. The aircraft was repaired and continued to fly. So I think part of the problem is sort of looking at the airline in airline industry in its context, you are significantly more likely to be injured or killed going to the airport than you are flying. Yet we all get behind the wheel of cars. We all get behind, we all get into a taxi with somebody whose driving credentials we have had no opportunity to scrutinise. I think that the difference with aviation is that people don't have the ability, or don't feel they have the ability, to be in control. If you're on a bus or a train or in a car, you feel that you could, if you're driving the car, you could avoid an accident, or if you're in the bus or a train, you could escape out a window if necessary. And so people aren't quite as concerned. But in an aircraft, you're not issued with parachutes, you're issued with life jackets. And I think that the fact that people are not in control and feel not in control contributes to a much higher sense of risk or of danger than is actually there. And humans are very bad at evaluating those high impact, very, very low likelihood risks. They're just not something that our brains do very well.
Right, so it's a bit about the sense of vulnerability and loss of control. Tobias, you mentioned the point about pilot error or the human error factor. And when the Malaysia Airlines plane was scrutinised, officials said the plane's communication systems were deliberately cut, and there was all this scrutiny on the crew and their backgrounds, which begs the question, should passengers have the right to know more about the histories of the crew or the crews employed on airlines? Is there a need for greater transparency, do you think?
I think that is a very difficult question, because if you start to check your pilots prior to a flight, you have also to check your taxi driver, which drives you to the airport, or the bus driver. I think that would change nothing, because you can create images.
Sorry to jump in, but we don't feel so vulnerable in the taxi or the bus, as John pointed out, do we? Isn't there a difference there? We feel completely vulnerable at 30,000 feet up in the air.
Yeah, but that's true. But you can also lose your life in a taxi or a bus, because the bus driver or the taxi driver has some bad ideas or takes some strange actions. And the same can happen, of course, in an aircraft. And we have examples for that. Remember that Egypt Air flight years ago, where obviously the pilot pushed the stick in that way that the aircraft crashed into somewhere in the North Atlantic. Of course, the human factor is there. You can't know everything about somebody.
John, give us an idea of how much variation. All right, go ahead. No, I'll let you speak.
I would agree with that, actually. I think that the comfort that the average traveller can take is that standards worldwide are very high, and standards for example, the EU and the US for non-EU and US carriers flying in and out are also very high, and they are fairly rigorously monitored. For example, within Indonesia, there is a handful of 5 airlines, including Indonesia AirAsia, which are allowed to fly into the EU because they've been assessed by EU safety regulators as safe airlines. And I think that people's comfort should come from the fact that these pilots have thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of training and experience. This flight's pilot in command, Irianto, for example, is a very experienced airman. 20,000 plus flying hours, 6,100 flying hours in this very plane for this very airline, which of course means that he was flying around these very routes and experienced with this weather. There is something went wrong on this flight, clearly, but I don't think that looking at the level of pilot experience would have given the people on board any real ability to make any informed sort of decision about this.
All right, maybe not pilot experience, but then Tobias, some of the pilots we've spoken to have said that, the type of training of how you deal with an emergency situation can differ. How much variation, they give us examples of handling wing load when you ascend or descend, the rules on that. How standardized are those sorts of rules and procedures, and how much variation is there in the commercial aviation industry?
So basically there's very little variation. Everything is pretty standardized. Pilots following standardized regulations, mostly given by the aircraft manufacturers and out of the experience from a lot of flights, a lot of accidents and incidents. The variation might be there if a pilot comes in a difficult situation and then gets in panic. And that's a human reaction which you can't disclose. Possibly something happened with AirAsia as well. So the pilot, very experienced, 20,000 plus hours in the seat. If he gets in panic because he does not recognize certain conditions, then he will use variations which are completely out of standardized procedures.
Now, one issue that there is a variation on, John, is flight routes, right? How close or far you fly from conflict zones. We saw tragically the second incident involving Malaysia Airlines, involving an airliner that was shot out of the sky over the Ukraine. How much of a right should passengers have, as well as their relatives, to know what changes are being made in flight routes, which I understand is something that can be made quite quickly and rapidly by airlines?
Yes, and in many ways on an airline-by-airline basis. One of the very useful discussions that was started after the MH17 disaster was that national regulators are starting to take a closer look at when and where their airlines fly and what they overfly, and how risk is communicated there. Let's be clear. This situation doesn't happen very frequently. I can think of 3 to 5 situations in all of the history of aviation where a commercial airliner has been brought down by military hardware. Now there are questions to be asked about what policies airlines have in terms of overflying and what their thresholds are. But I think those are discussions to be had between regulators and airlines. I think that people have to have trust in their national regulators, whose procedures they dictate indirectly.
How can they be asked to have trust if some airliners are flying over conflict zones and it ends in the sort of scenes that we've seen, unfortunately, for one Malaysia Airlines flight? Shouldn't there be some, public redress other than simply trusting in the national air regulator?
Well, that's one of the things that's coming out of this. They're trying to link up the various national regulators together with national risk and the larger air regulators like the FAA or the European regulators or the Japanese regulators, for example, who often have additional information and additional intelligence to enable the same decisions to be made, the same good decisions to be made by all carriers. Now, that I think is something to applaud, and I think that's something that needs to be pushed forwards.
All right. Why can't, Tobias, why can't some of these rules, which clearly do vary, why can't they be standardized? Why are we still talking about attempts to create a more sort of standard authority to look into these sorts of rules?
Yeah, a difficult question. I think no country wants to give away its regulations and its power to make regulations. But in fact, it would be a wise decision if we would have something like a regulatory body, let's call it IATA, which simply creates some standards with regards to war zones or conflict zones. And then all IATA members, at least all IATA members, could follow these standards. I think it's pretty difficult to set standards in one regulatory body for the whole planet. That will simply not happen. We still have parts of in this planet where even a single sky is not thinkable and thus not possible. And I think that counts also to such standardization. But the IATA would be a start where all IATA members agree to create certain standards for these situations and follow them.
All right, we will at this point thank our guests for their contributions, Tobias Rueckerl and John Walton. Thank you very much. And of course you can find more on this show as well as the others if you head over to our website. That's at aljazeera.com. Post us your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thanks for watching. For now, it's goodbye.